Welcome to a conversation with Great Lakes advocate and author Jane Elder to discuss her new book, Wilderness, Water, and Rust. I'm Liz Kirkwood, Executive Director of For Love of Water, a Great Lakes legal and water policy center based here in Traverse City, Michigan. I'd like to begin our event by remembering that For Love of Water is located on lands historically and presently occupied by the Anishinaabeg, Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations. We honor the past and present original water protectors of the Three Fires Confederacy. Today's book talk is part of FLOW's Art Meets Water initiative, which celebrates the creativity and talent of activist artists, as well as the powerful artistic expressions inspired by the Great Lakes and the natural world. I'm particularly excited for today's conversation because Jane Elder is a true Great Lakes advocate and one of my personal heroes. We served on the International Joint Commission's Water Quality Board together. And unfortunately, I joined as she was departing. But I immediately knew that she had a brilliant policy mind dedicated to protecting these freshwater seas, as you will see today. Before I introduce you to our amazing host and moderator, Dave Dempsey, who is FLOW's Senior Policy Advisor, I'd like to take a brief moment to introduce FLOW and the work we do. Our mission is to ensure that the waters of the Great Lakes Basin are healthy, public, and protected for all. Our work extends beyond the Great Lakes themselves to include groundwater, wetlands, rivers, streams, and the inland lakes across the basin. Our key priorities include advocating for public trust law to safeguard natural resources and address the impacts of climate change, promoting legislation that addresses chemical, septic, and plastic pollution, supporting the state of Michigan's and the Bad River Band's legal sovereignty to revoke and terminate the Line 5 easements and oppose the proposed tunnel and the pipeline reroute, resisting the diversion, privatization, and commodification of our precious shared waters, and advocating for regenerative agricultural practices that prevent pollution from factory farms. Now, as you can see, FLOW's team is very busy working to safeguard the interconnected waters of the Great Lakes Basin. Thank you for being here this afternoon and for your support of FLOW's mission. I'd like to introduce Dave, who, in addition to being a prolific author himself, Dave has 40 years of experience in environmental policy. He served as environmental advisor to former Michigan Governor James Blanchard and as policy advisor on the staff of the International Joint Commission, established under the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty between the US and Canada. During our talk, we'll have time for audience questions. And if you have a question, please put it in the Zoom Q&A, and we'll try to answer as many as time allows. Thank you for being here. And Dave, over to you.
Thank you, Liz, and welcome everybody to this very wonderful opportunity to talk to Jane Elder. She's got the heart of a lion, the pen of a poet, and the brain of an Einstein when it comes to the Great Lakes. I just want to run through a little bit about her vast experience. She's, of course, a native of Michigan with a degree from Michigan State University. She served for 18 years in various capacities with the Sierra Club, including serving as the director of the Great Lakes program in Madison, Wisconsin. She was director of the Biodiversity Project for 10 years and also director of the Wisconsin Academy of Arts and Sciences for 10 years. It's really my honor and privilege to see you, Jane. Thanks for coming today. And why don't you tell us a little bit about your book?
Well, I'm going to take us through a slideshow journey very quickly. And then I think we'll have some time for a discussion between the two of us and then some questions from the audience. So this is how the Great Lakes look at night. They're vast and breathtaking, but surrounded by densely populated human activity. The book's prologue talks about how we got here and the implications. My own timeline in the region began when I was born in Flint, Michigan in 1954, 8 days after General Motors celebrated their production of the 50 millionth car. My dad worked for AC Sparkplug and became part of commuting workforce when our small family moved south of Flint to Pine Lake in mid-1955. He built our house on weekends and evenings while working full-time at AC, supporting a wife and 2 little kids. But our stories are entwined with a deeper history of everyone's stories in the Great Lakes region. Before European contact, the indigenous people had their own complex and dynamic history, from the mouth of the St. Lawrence River to the watersheds of western Lake Superior. The arrival of the French explorers and missionaries launched a series of economic boom and bust cycles that shaped our culture, economy, and the health of the Great Lakes, and it's been that way ever since. The fur trade turned the beaver into an international commodity and shaped the commerce and early settlement of the region. Let's fast forward a few hundred years to 1814 and the Treaty of Ghent, which settled the terms of the War of 1812. The United States and Canada divided up the ownership of the region, and both parties walked away from a British promise for a permanent homeland for the indigenous people. This opened the door for American and Canadian settlement in both young nations. With fur trade exhausted, the new settlement focused on farming, fishing, logging, and generated more cycles of boom and bust. We reached peak fish in the Great Lakes at the end of the 19th century. The logging boom rose and played itself out in the early next century. Likewise, the mining boom for iron ore and copper declined as mines were depleted. Then the auto industry and manufacturing booms rose in the mid-20th century, and that industrial capacity made the Great Lakes region a place where we could provide capacity for World War II, which became another boom in its own way. After the war, industrial expansion spread across the region. Old industries grew and new industries took off. But there were costs from 400 years of extracting the natural capital of the land and waters, and we began to pay new attention across the nation to the environment in the 1960s. In the Great Lakes region, Lake Erie was in terrible trouble, and some even called it dead. Across the region, the lake trout were crashing, and alewives were washing up in dead heaps on Lake Michigan shores. People began to rise to a call for action. And the first section of the book talks about activism, including my own motivation to be involved. The environmental movement was emerging in part by other activism of the era, notably the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And Earth Day blossomed in 1970 and framed the concept of environmentalism. The Love Your Mother Earth Day poster made a big impression on me in 1972 when my biology teacher hung it in our high school classroom. That fall, I headed to Michigan State University as a young freshman and volunteered in the McGovern campaign. The McGovern loss was crushing, but a friend challenged me with that classic statement, "Don't mourn, organize." And he said, if you care about the environment so much, join an environmental group. So I became a Sierra Club volunteer. Environmental issues were everywhere, from smog that choked cities and the algae that choked Lake Erie. There was plenty to do. Other major and social political influence of the early 70s were, for me, the women's movement and Watergate. Back to nature was calling to a lot of us. In the book I write, perhaps the wild country represented an unsullied ideal that needed protection in its own right, a place to breathe in strange times, but my political convictions are linked with a yearning to be connected to nature. In a world where I was living through napalm and Nixon on one hand, and white pine and clear water on the other, it was an easy choice as to which is more enduring and valuable for the sustenance of life itself. Working on Michigan's winning ballot initiative to reinstate returnable bottles, and we won in 1976, opened doors in the field. And I became the Michigan Sierra Club's first paid lobbyist, and probably the only lobbyist in the Capitol who was female and in their 20s. When the chapter ran out of funds to pay me in 1979, I moved to Madison, Wisconsin for a job at the National Sierra Club's Midwest office and was there for more than a decade. It was a dream job, and I didn't know at the time that it was during a golden era in the environmental movement. During this era, we took on the Reagan administration, and we lobbied on major legislation across the spectrum of environmental issues, covering 1/4 of the United States Congress with 3 staff. This was hard and relentless work. The next 2 sections of the book talk about the challenges and achievements of these years. The land issues discuss wilderness and public lands and the growing pains of the young Great Lakes National Lakeshores. It took us 10 years and 5 sessions of Congress to pass the Michigan Wilderness Bill, a mere 91,535 precious acres in 10 areas in Michigan's national forests. In 1988, I wrote, "Together we have done no small thing. As long as our democracy persists, these fragments of wilderness will remain wild. The loons will call it Sylvania. Lake Michigan will wash up against an unspoiled shore at the foot of Lake Nordhaus Dunes, and every spring, the waters will pour over the falls on the Yellow Dog at McCormick. This is our wilderness to enjoy, to cherish, and to learn from, and it will be our children's. Thank you all for making a dream come true." The young Great Lakes National Lakeshores were struggling with appropriations, management plans, and land acquisition. In Chapter 7, I write about the highly charged controversial road along the Pictured Rocks escarpment. It took 18 years to pass legislation to deauthorize the road. I wrote, if we did nothing else in our careers beyond stopping the bulldozers from gouging a 2-lane corridor through the birch forests and maple forests along the sacred shores of Pictured Rocks, Congressman Bob Carr and I and the stalwart others who carried the torch will have done enough. Part 3 shifts to talk about water and the Great Lakes in particular. Great Lakes activism rose in the 1960s and 70s in what I call the first wave. It took on visible pollution, thermal pollution, and other threats. The era established the first Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement between the United States and Canada. It generated phosphorus bans for detergents in many states and provinces and passed the first truly modern Clean Water Act in the US. But with all that remarkable progress, the lakes still weren't healthy. I entered the picture in the second wave. We took on toxic pollution and organized a binational coalition spanning 8 states and 2 provinces. Our coalition organized a series of annual week-long lobbying events in Washington, D.C., the most notable of which included what became known as the Toxic Buffet, where all the food and drink at a Capitol Hill reception, including the drinking water, came from the Great Lakes. We wanted our members of Congress to see the issues that their constituents were facing in the districts back home. We also drew attention when we brought a live cormorant to an oversight hearing in 1989. That effort and other efforts helped us succeed in a new generation of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement in 1987, which set goals for cleaning up the 42 toxic hotspots in the region. We were also able to modify the Clean Air Act to control toxic air pollution and many other gains. We thought we had done something big, but didn't anticipate the backsliding that would come. Part 4 is my celebration of treasured places in the wilderness and lakeshores in the region, with a focus on Sylvania and Pictured Rocks. After the political battle scars from all the legislative campaigns, I avoided locations filled with memories of conflict for decades. A colleague said to me, never vacation in an area that hasn't been saved yet. And even after, it takes a while. My husband and I returned to Sylvania for the first time in 2001 and many years thereafter. I wrote in my journal, in wilderness more than any other place I know, you can go home again. These chapters celebrate the wilderness experience and the ecological benefits of protected habitat and my very deep connection to Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore. Part 5, Reaping What We Have Sown, is about reckoning with the impacts of human decisions and our environment and public health. I talk about the ongoing legacy of toxic contamination 37 years after we fought to clean up air and water emissions and toxic hotspots. While there has been progress, mercury and PCBs are still serious contaminants in the Great Lakes, and now we're dealing with many others, such as PFAS. Of the areas of concern, those toxic hotspots, after 37 years, only 9 are off the list, and we only have 34 sites to go. I also talk about other unresolved threats, such as the algal pollution and the invasive species and habitat disruption, all of which affect the Great Lakes. Beginning in the 1970s and through many decades thereafter, we were living through the bust of one of the region's greatest booms, and that was the domestic auto industry. The wake spread across other industries, and we were labeled the Rust Belt. Flint became a symbol, but the impact was real and devastating, and not just for Flint. And while we've made significant progress in the region, many communities still have a very long way to go. Speaking of the auto industry, Its historic resistance to auto efficiency standards contributed to today's global loading of greenhouse gases. These were all human choices. At the end of this chapter, where I talk about water quality or air quality, when you get caught between the moon and Detroit, I write, climate change is not just another issue to worry about in the Great Lakes region. It is the overarching issue that makes everything else more difficult. Every effort to delay action, to reduce emissions is a threat to us, to our children, and the biosphere. And that leads us to finding our way forward. I talk about how much has changed in terms of advancing environmental policy over the last several decades, beginning with Ronald Reagan, who initiated the government is the problem movement that still plagues us today. When we were most successful in the then times, the branches of government were a mean to achieve our ends. But today the government is under attack while its critics use its dysfunction as a tool to realign public policy with increasingly constrained rules for the public. Then to the hard question, what can we do? I propose some pretty large strategic shifts. That we first embrace a new relationship with the natural world, focused on respect and reciprocity. That we manage, if you can, manage nature as a living, connected system instead of within the silos that we deal with now. That we diversify the region's economy and embrace green manufacturing, but also transform agriculture from extractive practices to regeneration. And then finally, we want to build healthy and just human communities in partnership with restoring ecological health. The chapter Wonder, Love, Grit, and Wisdom explores things that I think are essential to problem solving and leadership, and celebrates the wisdom of mentors and leaders I have known. I wrap up this section by talking about environmental education in the context of the world our children are inheriting, and ways that we can inspire not only knowledge, but their ability to care. In the final section, Reflections, the chapter Loss, Hope, and Courage talks about what it takes for us to get up in the morning and do what needs to be done. And the final chapter, Lake Water Lapping, is a treasured remembrance of the shores of Lake Superior. And I want to thank all the sources or images. And I want to thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Jane. So many questions follow that presentation. I want to start with one that has to do with what you mentioned about being one of the first female lobbyists, or maybe the first in the history of the Sierra Club. What were the obstacles and opportunities that being the first female lobbyist offered to you?
Oh, it was awful. And I mean, it was a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. But these were the days where nearly the entire legislature was male. The press corps was male. Other than nice secretaries in the offices, you know, it was a pretty lonely place. There were a handful of us there. So I remember testifying the first time I did it on a wetlands hearing, and colorful old Senator Joe Mack was around in those days. I, you know, had practiced and rehearsed my testimony and how many minutes would it take and which points were underlined with my college highlighter, all those things. I did my testimony, and he leaned forward and he said, "Isn't it nice to see young ladies involved in the political process?" And then completely blew away everything else I said. And so there was a lot of dismissiveness and patronizing. I was delighted. Hugh McDermott, who was the environmental reporter and political reporter for the Detroit Free Press, took pity on me and helped shepherd me through and told me who to avoid in the halls and all of those kinds of things. And he ended up calling me kid. But Hugh was one of the people who made working in the legislature both helpful, survivable, and he also, you know, knew these people very well and knew how they thought, and would share things about, you know, this person's not going to work with that person. And I got a lot of tips that I never thought I would, just I think because he wanted to help me along. I'm pleased to say the Michigan Wetlands Bill did pass, and there was a big coalition. So I learned a lot about the process. I learned a lot about harassment, but it prepared me for what was next.
One of the themes of the book and of your presentation was the two different eras of Great Lakes activism and achievement. The 70s and early 80s were really a time of success. And then since then, we've seen a lot of backsliding. What are the differences that made that happen?
Well, I think things shifted with the Reagan administration, right? Where Congress really stopped focusing on policy and enacting new regulatory systems and such. We haven't had a significant new environmental statute passed in probably 2 or 3 decades now. And so the shift to appropriations and federal, looking at where we spend the money as opposed to what we're trying to achieve with it became a big part of it. I think too, the binational coalition that we had began to fade for a couple of reasons. One, when we pushed the toxics agenda very hard, trying to get to what we called zero discharge or no elimination, no dilution of toxic pollutants. The chemical industry backlash was aggressive and successful. And the International Joint Commission was never the same again after those years. When you have people saying, well, these public meetings are circuses and we can't have that in our decorum. But it was all excuses to, I think, dampen the public enthusiasm. And the loss of the binational community, if you will, is another reason I think Great Lakes activism changed. We're in what I would call now the third wave, which has been around the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And I think restoration is critical. But if you don't stop the new stuff coming in, just restoring what's the legacy pollutants and the damaged habitat is insufficient if we're not dealing with the new threats to the lakes, whether that's pharmaceutical compounds, microplastics, the fact that we still don't regulate agricultural and water pollution in this country. If we don't deal with those things, we're going to be in a perpetual, we'll always be restoring. We'll never be healthy. We'll never be vital.
How do we deal with all of them? Is there some overall rubric that can help us deal with everything?
Well, I think we have been tinkering with the symptoms for the longest time, and our regulatory systems are set up to deal with the symptoms. We regulate water after it starts polluting, right? And so if we could shift to preventative and precautionary strategies, I look at the Food and Drug Administration. We don't put dangerous food out in the market and wait for people to get sick before we regulate it. We don't put dangerous and experimental medications out without a rigorous review process. But for industrial chemicals, that's not there. And in a sense, all chemicals are innocent until proven guilty. And PFAS is an excellent example of that. Had we had the precautionary and preventative framework in place, we wouldn't be dealing with what we're dealing with now. And it's sort of now wash, rinse, and repeat for whatever the next new generation of chemicals that comes into the environment is. So I think we need these big sort of thinking shifts, strategic shifts, policy shifts, even paradigm shifts in terms of, our relationship with the natural environment has been for almost 400 years. Find it, take it, use it, leave your mess behind, and leave others to clean up the mess. And that's, completely unsustainable. But that's the way our legal frameworks have been set up and the way many of our industrial practices have been set up. So how do we get to those mind shifts? I think we ask people to step back and ask the why questions. We had a question about litter yesterday, and we talked about why is there so much junk in our lives in the first place? And so litter is the end point of that. But what are the beginning points? What is the starting point? We talk about drivers, we talk about root causes. And if we could look within not just the environmental movement, other movements, what are these underlying root causes? Follow the money, follow the structures. How did we get here? Do we have to stay here? We've been in some of these systems so long, many people don't even think about questioning them. Agricultural policy in the United States is something we've been living with. The current policy is roughly 50 years. And I'd love a new generation to come along and say, why is this? Why are we doing this? Why are we continuing to grow crops that many of us don't eat? Why do we have an economic system around agriculture as opposed to a food system around health? Part of it is just pulling back the lens a little bit and asking the big why questions.
I see we have several questions from the audience. Let's start with the first. How do you daily keep the strength, will, hope, and when you're up against huge corporate greed?
Well, maybe Dave, I'll start with the question about hope.
Sure.
So I have a little section in the book where I talk about what it takes to get up in the morning. And part of it is never throw in the towel and never agree that someone else has won. Don't give them that permission. But in the book I write, people ask me whether I'm optimistic, and I say instead that I choose to be hopeful. I have pondered poet Václav Havel's distinctions between the two, optimism being a confidence that things will turn out well, and hope being an ability to work for something because it is good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed. He also says that hope is an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart, and that it is this hope, above all, which gives us the strength to live and continually try new things, even in conditions that seem as hopeless as ours do here and now. And he was writing this a few decades ago in his hopeless situation. But in recent years, I've heard thoughtful leaders talk about hope being helpful, but courage being essential. During the first 2 years of the pandemic, I had a little sticker with the word courage on it that I saved from the sheet of Rosa Parks Forever stamps that it came on. And I put that on my computer monitor so I could see it every morning when I booted up. And it helped me stay focused on showing up and getting the essential things done in the swirling uncertainty and anxiety of those times. The Oxford Dictionary says courage is the ability to do something that frightens oneself or strength in the face of pain or grief. Facing climate change and its twin, the extinction crisis, along with all of our other environmental challenges, can indeed be frightening. The stakes are high and the opposition is well-funded. These overarching threats can also trigger the pain and grief of known or impending loss. But courage can kindle the strength to keep working anyway, to build alliances and to lift each other up. It is good to strive for life and beauty and wholeness. We don't know where and when the unexpected breakthroughs will come, but if we don't try, they most certainly won't. And maybe, just maybe, they will surprise us and reward us and future generations in ways beyond our imagination.
Great, little hope. It does help. Another question from the audience. Some of my environmental heroes, Doug Peacock, Edward Abbey, and your fellow MSU alum, Jim Harrison, came to the conclusion that developed industrial society is fundamentally incompatible with a wilderness environment. The question is, are you still hopeful of creating a world where industry and environmental organizations can work together?
Well, I think it's essential for the survival of humans and the planet. And I'm hopeful about things like the 30 by 30, 30% of the land protected by 2030 is one goal. A more ambitious one, 50% of the planet for nature. They're great concepts. What I don't see is the execution happening. And the 50% for the planet looks at the ability to have layers of what I would call wilderness and natural areas, some which are more populated than others, but where the natural systems are the primary ways of moving energy and food and keeping the biological systems healthy. And the United Nations has some very exciting work going on, as does the global organizations working in this space. So if we can move in those directions, I think there will always be likely some kinds of manufacturing and industry and products in our lives. What we haven't figured out is how to share the planet, the living systems, the critical habitats, the healthy biosphere. And in part because when your big goal is profit as opposed to survival, the agenda is different. And market-driven solutions don't take in a sense, don't monetize human health, the future, children, swans, right?
Right.
Those things are not in there. So as long as we're driven by money as the goal for human life on Earth, we won't get there. There are hopeful signs that a lot of people don't see that as the key to happiness and health anymore. So I think it's not a harsh dichotomy between truly carefully protected wilderness and industrial Armageddon.
Mm-hmm.
But how are the spaces in between being taken care of, and what are we doing to rebuild healthy systems that need it and do it fast enough? And that's where some of my optimism is a little soft.
Right.
But I think people see there are pathways forward. The question is, will we choose them?
A related question is, are there examples of public-private partnerships around the Great Lakes that work well?
Oh, lots of them, lots of.
What are they? Tell me. Want to know?
Oh, gosh, now I'm trying to think, I look at where, you know, even frankly, some of the cleanups of the areas of concern, we tend not to think of these as public-private partnerships, but you have to have partnerships between the affected community, so local government, state government, the affected industries, communities in those areas. I'm excited to see some of the work that's happening in Buffalo as they look at the restoration there, to really focus in more than the uses of the site for redevelopment, but uses of the site to restore a healthy natural riparian area. So between nonprofits and local governments, there's a lot of great stuff going on. And all it takes is sitting down and finding the common goals and figuring out whose role can be effective, and shaking the hands and getting the work done, sharing a little turf. You know, it's we tend to think of coalition building as all nonprofits, but coalitions where you have private partners and where you have government can be some of the most successful ones.
The first word in the title of your book is wilderness. And you and I have had, well, you're primarily one of the primary architects of the Michigan Wilderness Act, which you discussed, which is a huge achievement just to get past the interests that were against it. You and I have had this discussion about wilderness. What is it? And there are those who say wilderness excludes the indigenous because it implies that there were no people here, and we're going to go back to a state of nature that was pristine. So how do you deal with that issue?
Well, you know, I think those are mostly academic questions. You know, there's a legal definition for federal wilderness in the United States, and that's probably the one that people default to as the most restrictive. But even within designated federal wilderness area, most areas are open, not all, but most, to hunting, fishing, gathering, and so the place remains available for people who've used it, you know, 1,000 years or just discovered it the next day. But I think the pristine argument doesn't work. And I also think the no one was ever here argument doesn't work. But as you look at these landscapes, you know, people have moved in and out of them, changed them in their own ways. What hasn't changed is the wholesale sort of health of nature being the driver in keeping that place healthy. And the indigenous nations who succeeded with healthy, you know, food supplies and water supplies, we're doing it in partnership with those areas, in partnership with nature, as opposed to let's come in, let's dominate, and let's take what we need and leave. It was a relationship. And so I think the arguments around wilderness often tend to go into these academic categories, but this, as we look at things like the United Nations program and these more global efforts on how do we stabilize the planet, again, that notion of a gradient from some places where mostly people don't go there because they're very, very fragile, or they're at risk, and other places where you have the indigenous populations living in places where they've always lived, raising food, raising families, living well. So I don't see it as necessarily black and white. I think we need to respect the sort of laws and regulations that are out there, but we certainly need more healthy land. It doesn't all have to be in the wilderness system, but I look at, again, those places in between. What are we doing? Whether it's a city watershed or whether it's the headwaters of a system that's feeding into the Great Lakes. What are we doing to protect the whole system, where many of the wilderness areas can be standouts, but they're a pretty small part of the landscape, especially in the East.
You're stimulating a lot of questions. So let's see. Environmental advocacy means living with grim facts and discouraging results. It's crucial to have fun too. So when are the next follies?
All right, Marty Fluharty, I'm guessing that's you and somebody else from the Sierra Club days. So absolutely, I write about, you know, Lee Botts and I used to talk about burnout, and she would say, take time off, make another quilt, you know, do things that are, I call it restoration ecology at the personal scale.
Mhm.
And this is not guilt, this is not self-indulgence, it's just wise human mental health. But for about, I think 8 years in the Sierra Club, you know, you're dealing with really intense, crazy stuff, and you have to laugh, and you have to have a good sense of humor. So I was one of the instigators of what we call the Sierra Club Follies, where we did a complete musical parody every year at the national board meeting with board members playing ridiculous roles and staff playing ridiculous roles. But hit songs included Greener Than Greenpeace, a song about John Dingell when we were, you know, fighting the Clean Air Act, and to be able to see the absurdity that you're working in and still show up, and to feel the camaraderie of other people who know what we're doing is madness, what we're doing is impossible. Let's do it anyway, and let's find a way to have fun. And so fun is part of it. If you're not having fun, why show up? You know, when it becomes the grim trudge, you bring your colleagues down, and you just need to step away and give yourself time to, you know, rebuild your confidence, replenish your own sense of why you're here and the energy, and then find ways to laugh about the absurd, because a lot of what's happening in our world today, how do we describe it other than it is just plain absurd? So yes, having fun is essential. And I talk, you know, I mentioned the book, lifting each other up. You know, keep an eye out for your friends and colleagues. If somebody's having a really rough go, but go take a hike, you know, or go to an art museum or something that pulls you out of your, you know, your inner turmoil about what's going on, or your sense of not having any agency, and find a way to have that agency. And I have at least 3 quilts that I've done as part of the Leibot's prescription. And we're both gardeners. I also do, you know, other things that allow me to have tangible progress. One of the joys of quilting is every stitch is progress. And I look at things where I can complete this. No one else is going to undermine this with a last minute lobbying maneuver, right? Find something that you have efficacy in, and that's very rewarding, at least for me.
What role, if any, do you envision for the religious and spiritual community in environmental protection? And how essential is their involvement?
I think it's very important. When I worked for the Biodiversity Project, one of our strong partners was the religious community. And I'd look at things like Wisconsin had the, you know, Wisconsin Power and Light, but the light, right, was spiritual light. And because many people use religion to justify environmental decisions, it's very important to have those conversations about ethics. What is the right thing to do? How do we know what guides us? I also think it takes you out of the realm of human futility. And allows you to embrace the beauty of nature and ways that transcend. That's a, you know, that's a nice green tree. And I write about when I'm at Pictured Rocks. For me, it's a very sacred space and a very spiritual place. And whether you call it evolution, whether you call it the creator, whether you call it God, to acknowledge and appreciate these forces around us that have created such extraordinary beauty and so much bounty on this one little planet. We don't know of any other planets like us. And I'm so grateful I ended up on this. But the religious community can contribute in so many ways and already has. And I look at everything from work at the congregational level to being voices for, and certainly this was the case on biodiversity, for the appreciating God's creation and its wholeness. Every religious community and every religious practice has its own views on nature. And when I was at Biodiversity Project, we wrote a book on spirituality and biodiversity. And you can see the comparison contrasts across traditions. But if you understand them, it's also easier to sit down with somebody who doesn't think like you and dig a little bit deeper into their motivations. And so, yes, I think very important. And I know Dan Robertson, I would say the Great Lakes Spirituality Project, wonderful project. Look it up. They're doing great things.
Next question has to do with the industrial extraction area. Before we get to that, though, I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about Flint, the area where you grew up, and what you've seen happen over the last several decades there.
I'm going to grab a little excerpt here if I can from the book,
Sure.
and then So, most of my experience goes back to being a kid and going back and forth, but to see grandparents and such, and then growing up as a young adult and then coming back to see family. But I think if the observation here still sticks, when a company leaves behind the company town, people with grit and imagination will try their best to rebuild a functioning community because they value the place they call home, including its history. But in Flint and so many other industrial cities, the odds are stacked so high against these new pioneers because the old model is broken and the capital has been used up or gone elsewhere. Sometimes grit just isn't enough. Instead, can we imagine what wholeness looks like for people and communities and the natural world in this region, with its green landscapes and sparkling lakes and rivers, sweet corn summers and winter wonderlands? Our hearts long to live near the banks of cold water and the gentle rivers, lakes, and fields of this giving landscape. If we give back to the landscape and not just take, if we build communities that nurture, sustain, and lift each other, and not just the suits and the C-suites, maybe we can restore and nurture a sustainable good life in the region of the greatest lakes in the world. To get there, it will take policy, political engagement, and a new vision for the region. But who better than those of us who love the freshwater heart of North America to create that shining new future?
Building on that, the audience question in part says, who should be responsible for or what infrastructure exists to repair and restore the waters and lands in these areas and help with healing?
That is such an important question. I think in a different era, government would be playing a very significant role. And I think we need to work to make sure that our government does that to restore healthy and safe conditions for all the people. And we need to be able to advocate for that and to push for that. And, Great Lakes Restoration is an initiative of one effort doing that in pieces. But many, many communities need it at a very local level and at a very personal level. I also think it's so important to listen to the people in the communities who are already there. These folks know what they need. They know what's happened. They know where they want to see things improve. And I've been really excited to see groups like Milwaukee Water Commons working very, very closely with neighborhoods on everything from urban tree reforestation to lead pipes, to water quality, to access to the lakeshore. The people living in these communities know what needs to be done. Do they potentially need technical support from experts, and do they need money? Yes. So building those partnerships, starting with the voice of the local communities, is critical. But I do think as we look at where we're going with restoration longer term, we need to be able to move beyond just the appropriations process into a new era of environmental legislation that would help us focus public funds and common objectives around these areas. So much right now is piecemeal and patchwork, and that might work for quilts. But for the communities that we're trying to restore, they need a lot more resources to get those long-term plans dealt with. And the fact that we've got many areas that, 34 years down the road, they're chipping away at progress, but that chipping away leaves a lot of threats in place. So really good question. I also think, of course, we are finally in a place where we're listening to Indigenous knowledge. And one of my friends said, only took you guys 400 years.
Right.
But there are people who've lived here for a very long time who understand so much, and being willing to listen, to learn, to share partnerships, and to make sure that we're engaging that Indigenous knowledge and community knowledge in solutions that can work for all of us.
You mentioned the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which was born in 1972 and was seen by many people as a driver of Great Lakes progress. More recently, not so much. The last revision, I think, took effect in 2012.
Yeah.
And it's now up for review again, public review and comment. What's your advice on what should be done and what's wrong, or not wrong, but what's lacking in the current agreement?
Well, I was disappointed in the 2012 agreement, profoundly disappointed in the 2012 agreement. In part, it took out a lot of the target lists and many of the benchmarks towards which we were striving. And I think we need to have benchmarks, objectives, measurable achievements, accountability in a new agreement. We also need to deal with climate change in the new agreement. The current one encourages exchange of research across the borders between the United States and Canada. Great. But these scientists already know each other and they're already collaborating. What we need is a strategy. There is no comprehensive strategy for the Great Lakes to deal with climate change, whether we're dealing with emissions or how do we make sure the systems here, natural systems and the human communities, are able to adapt, able to be resilient, able to move forward, and that we have consistent solutions across the basin. So one community upstream is not taking an action that might be a threat to another community downstream. But we don't even have the agencies that can be in charge of these things at this point. EPA will do its part, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration will do their part, but no one's really steering the overarching plan and working with state and local governments. So I think some comprehensive guidance on climate goals and principles in the region is essential. I think we need to look at protecting the source waters after we saw what happened to Toledo after the algal bloom. We need to not just protect the water once it gets in the treatment plant. We need to treat it. We need to make sure it's clean and healthy and safe out in the lake where we're bringing those waters into the systems. We need to take another look at toxic substances because clearly the current pattern is not working. Yes, we're chipping away at the legacy chemicals, but the new ones are coming in and we don't have a preventative and precautionary strategy for toxic chemicals in the region, including radionuclides. And as we begin to retire a lot of these nuclear power plants, the stuff's got to go somewhere. And right now, every old plant becomes its own radioactive waste storage facility. So a lot of topics. And I also think, frankly, the relationship between the agreement and the governments themselves needs to be tightened because the agreement is not enforceable. Only the two nations individually can enforce it. And EPA and Canada's federal agencies need to stand up and honor these pledges, seek the appropriations to get the work done, and take the leadership role and not just use the agreement as a wouldn't it be nice document, but use it as something that drives mutual progress across the US and Canadian borders and the indigenous borders that also span the lakes.
Do you think the agreement ought to be a treaty or something more binding on the two governments?
I think it's certainly worth exploring a treaty. I know this would upset a lot of people. And I know many state agencies would be objecting to it because a treaty is managed by the State Department. The current agreement is managed by the EPA at the federal level. And that would be a very different experience for domestic agencies to be getting guidance from the State Department. But I think it's certainly worth doing some pros and cons analysis and what would be enforceable in a treaty and whether or not we would honor it, which is something the US has had some problems with when it comes to global environmental treaties. But I think we ought to explore it.
What about water commercialization? Do you see that as a threat to the Great Lakes?
It sort of already is. You know, when you look at the amount of bottled water or bottled beverages and such that aren't regulated in the same way under the Great Lakes Compact. I think as we look at climate change, no question in my mind, there'll be pressure on the Great Lakes to step up and deal with global water crises, if not regional ones. And as you know, the Great Lakes Compact has in it a clause that allows for dealing with the compassionate clause, really dealing with a human water crisis. But under what circumstances, under what guidelines, who will make this decision? How long would it be? We really need to tighten up the compact language so there's really a clear understanding of how do we protect the Great Lakes, deal with a short-term humanitarian crisis, but not become the world's solution to a global water crisis.
Well, we're getting close to the end of the conversation, but I want to thank you for all that you've done in your career. The question I wanted to ask you is environmental literacy. When I was talking to people 20 years ago about the boom and bust cycle of forest extraction in the Great Lakes region, one person came up to me at the end of the discussion and said, I never knew that the forests were logged. I just assumed the trees we see in the UP and northern Michigan have been there forever. So how do we get more people to know the basics.
Well, one of the reasons I wrote the book, right, is I wanted to capture some of the history of how we got to where we are today and to document how hard the work was along the way to get the protections that we do have in place. So I don't know what's happening in the school systems these days, but I think our sense of environmental history and our place on the land is not something that a lot of people know or understand. We're still a lot of people where you turn on the tap, water happens. You go to the grocery store, food happens. And so as we look at what I'm calling in one group, climate literacy, and we need environmental literacy. It's not just education. We need a basic literacy to understand our place in the natural world. And historically, much of that was a learned experience from living on a farm or, being in the natural world a lot of the time. But those stories are lost, and our human experience with them, I think, is fading. So I'd love to see an emphasis from K through life, understanding place, interactions, life. Why does this live here? Lee Botts was in her final years a great champion of the Learning Center at Indiana Dunes, and they focus on this, the questions, the inquiry. Why is this here? Why does this live next to this? How do I relate to this place? And again, rekindling that sense of relationship, respect, and understanding what's in this unique place. What does it need to thrive? Because when we understand what it needs to make a place thrive, we're probably going to thrive too.
Well, thanks a lot. I want to make sure people know this is a fantastic book. Buy it. It's got so much in it. It's got history. It's got storytelling. It's got policy advice and personal experience. It's really a rare and unique resource like Wilderness.
Well, thank you so much for everybody showing up today. It's been a pleasure to have this time with you.
Okay, I'll turn it back over to Megan to wrap up.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you again to the audience. Like Dave said, my name is Megan Kelto. I'm the Director of Public Engagement here at Flow. And I want to express our gratitude to Flow donors and supporters who make webinars like this possible, as well as the Art Meets Water initiative that Liz mentioned later. And Jane, thank you again so much for your generosity of time and spirit and thoughtful comments. I certainly enjoyed it. I know our audience did as well. We will follow up in a few days with a link to a recording of this webinar. Please feel free to both rewatch it yourself and share it with your friends and family who may take an interest in it. And again, a link to Jane's book is in the chat. We'll also include that in the email when we send that with the recording. And breaking news for you folks today on the webinar, I want to tease a new webinar we're working on. I don't have a date yet, but it will be in mid-July. And this will be a webinar about the Enbridge Line 5 situation. We're assembling an all-star panel of legal, policy, and advocacy experts. You won't want to miss that. We'll be rolling out information about that webinar in the upcoming weeks here. So please keep an eye out for that. Additionally, if you're interested in making a donation to enable future conversations like this one and to support Flow's work to keep the Great Lakes public, protected, and healthy for future generations as a shared resource, there is also a donate link in the chat if you feel so moved. And one final favor to ask before we say goodbye for the day, at the conclusion of this webinar, a survey link will pop up. Please let us know what you thought about the webinar and share your ideas for future webinars that you might be interested in. We really value your input. Thanks again, everyone. Have a terrific day, and we'll see you next time.